Welcome. I'm even going to build on hello. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to this public conversation on an issue that has dominated much of our community's public life and public debate in recent weeks. And it has to do with the question of how can we create public spaces that recognize and honor our national, state, and community histories in ways that are inclusive and in ways that might affirm shared community values and also honor the past in appropriate ways. So my name is Lloyd Kramer, and I'm a professor in the history department at UNC and also director of Carolina Public Humanities at UNC. This is the organization that has organized this event. This is our brochure. We have copies out here. We do lots of public programs. We are the unit within UNC's College of Arts and Sciences that serves as a bridge between the faculty and the community within the university and with people outside the university. So this forum has been organized in collaboration with people here at Chapel of the Cross, especially Ellen Cole and Boykin Bell. And I want to thank them for their assistance in all of the planning for this. And I also thank the church's rector, Elizabeth Marie Melchona, for welcoming us into this space. And this is a wonderful public space which connects this church community to the community beyond and also to the university. So, like other institutions in our community, the Chapel of the Cross has been re-examining its history and rethinking how to engage with the history of the 19th and 20th century. We're all dealing with the past, and I think that we're coming together here in a particularly important context, a context in which we are facing a highly charged political and cultural debate about what the university should do with Silent Sam, how the university should create monuments or change monuments, and how our community here is going to respond to directions from the UNC Board of Governors to find some solution to a certain kind of impasse that we seem to have reached. But I want to emphasize that our discussion here this evening has a broader framework beyond this immediate context, and we've brought together here a panel that can help us expand the conversation and find new ideas for how public spaces should represent collective historical memories. How can we use public spaces as a way to connect people rather than to pull people apart? And also, how can we possibly find new ways to listen to people with opposing views? Because in our polarized public life, is there any way to find a pathway toward some kind of reconciliation? It seems that almost everybody's position in the current debate, for example, is just baked in, and it's hard to figure out how to move beyond that impasse. So if the people in South Africa and people in other deeply divided societies could create truth and reconciliation commissions as a way to both confront the past honestly and move toward the future, can we do something similar in North Carolina, at UNC, in the Chapel Hill community? So this is the starting point for this evening's conversation. We're not exactly the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of South Africa, but we are a community in which we're going to have 6 panelists who are going to contribute their reflections on 3 related questions, and they can take this in various directions, all of which are connected to our current impasse. So their comments at the beginning might be compared to a series of op-ed commentaries, which you might say, I agree with that, I disagree with that, I never thought of that. So here are the 3 questions that we have posed for them to think about. What do you see as the biggest problem in creating shared public spaces that convey historical memories? How should an institution or public space that you care about address and convey the meaning of historical memories? What would be the way to do this? And what is your greatest concern about the current representations of historical memories here in North Carolina, or about the views of those with whom you disagree? What is your greatest concern about what's happening in the current debate and in relation to those you disagree with? So these are the questions that we're starting with, and we do not know where this is going to go. This is like improv theater, not improv comedy, but improv theater. The speakers are going to speak in alphabetical order. I'm going to introduce them very briefly. And I want to thank our Carolina Public Humanities staff, Max Orr, Paul Benici, and Rachel Shavitz, who are going to facilitate the discussion after each of these people have spoken. So here are our 6 wise contributors. First, Miranda Elston, who is a PhD candidate in art history at UNC Chapel Hill, who studies artistic perceptions of architectural space. She's also a former Maynard Adams Fellow for the Public Humanities, which is a program sponsored by Carolina Public Humanities to facilitate public engagement among graduate students in the humanities. Our second speaker will be James Nezer, former chancellor of UNC Chapel Hill, a longtime administrator at other universities, a leader in higher education, an expert on music history, an organist, and also a member of the Chapel of the Cross and part of the historical reflection in this community. Our third speaker will be Katie Murray, who is the coordinator of the Orange County Arts Commission, which provides support and funding for the arts throughout our county. She's also a member of the NC Plein Air Painters, which organize outdoor painting events of various kinds, like Impressionist painters in the 19th century, outdoors. Our next speaker will be Deborah Strowman, who teaches in the Gilling School of Public Health at UNC. She organizes and develops leadership and entrepreneurship programs. She serves as chairperson of the Orange County Human Relations Commission, and she's a frequent commentator on WCHL radio. Following Deborah will be Mike Wiley, an actor and playwright who interprets history through theatrical works, including the recent production of his important play, Leaving Eden, at Playmakers Theater. Maybe some of you saw this play. He received a Distinguished Alumnus Award from UNC Chapel Hill in 2017. And our sixth speaker will be Edwin Yoder, who is a former editor of the Daily Tar Heel, a longtime writer and columnist for newspapers in Washington, D.C., a recipient of the Pulitzer Prize for Editorial Writing, a contributing columnist to the News and Observer in Raleigh, and he also attends this church. That's the order in which we're going to speak. I've asked each of them to speak for 5 to 6 minutes, to be provocative and civil and engaging. So we will begin with Miranda Elston. And then there will be chances for all of you to engage their comment.
Okay, hello, can everyone hear me? I'm fighting a cold, so I apologize if I sound a little off right now. First, I would just like to thank the Public Humanities for inviting me to come speak today, for all the other panelists joining in this discussion. I come from the position of art historian, as has been introduced, but I am also someone that has taken part in the activism on our campus surrounding the Confederate monument known as Silent Sam as part of the sit-ins. From this background and experience, I think there are ways we can create inclusive public spaces, but we really have to look at the community to which these public spaces serve and what public spaces are. For example, our experience in an art museum is very different than from a corporal place or a public park, and is very different from a library because of the ways we can contextualize and use these as learning tools. We need to ask whether or not monuments in these places actually reflect our community ideals, which change and should change over time with the way we approach historical context and narrative. We must also look at the way art and artistic representation impacts our public spaces and the service of that community, and how these affects the ways we interpret our national history. Here on this campus, I believe we are embedded in a Confederate landscape as exemplified by the markers and monuments which surround us, from the monument of Silent Sam to the different names of buildings. To me, this is a problem. As an art historian, I understand the power of monuments and markers to establish historical memories that sustain and promote oppressive hierarchies. Monuments have the power to shape the collective memory and manipulate our recollection of the past. They stand before us in public spaces as established memories, which they are not. They are products of the culture that commissioned them, the artists who designed them, and those who paid for them. I believe that monuments as artistic objects are legitimate objects of historical study and should, in fact, be studied, for they tell us something about the context in which they are made. However, I believe that these monuments, when they reflect and visually reinforce a message of oppression and violence in our public spaces, should be removed. Monuments cannot be viewed as simply relics of the past. Their physical and symbolic existence extends into our present. I have firsthand seen how monuments such as Silent Sam can be used as locations of hate and violence. As someone who has participated in the peaceful sit-ins and demonstrations for the removal of Silent Sam, for instance, I have seen my colleagues screamed at, verbally threatened. They have received death threats, have been physically attacked, or violently arrested. I have had students, faculty, and staff tell me they feel unsafe on our campus, which is a public university, and that they are not represented here. Because of this, we must confront with how to deal with collective memory and public spaces in this current moment. And I personally think one of the ways we can approach this is also art as protest, which you can see in Maya Little's actions that took place a few months ago. From these experiences, I do not believe that our understanding of these public spaces and monuments can simply be done through contextualizing with informational plaques, because we are still affording these markers and monuments with a place of privilege and power in our public space. To re-envision public spaces, we need to find a way to make these places inclusive by bringing to light voices that have often been ignored or oppressed. As part of this, we should question historical and collective memories, and the ways in which we construct them as an integral part of our public spaces. We must deal with the critical conversations around national trauma, commemorative landscapes, and racial justice. But I do think there can be creative solutions that bring diverse communities together through collaboration, technology, and interpretive narratives. Museums, libraries, and academic institutions can play a foundational role, but only as far as they collaborate with the community that engages with these monuments and spaces on a daily basis. One of the ways we can come together is to recognize the power monuments and the impact of art on our public spaces have. Again, public art and monuments are not passive objects. Because of this, there is a long history of the removal or modification of monuments in public spaces to reflect these changes. For instance, I would like to note for later discussion just a few examples we could consider in the context of UNC. The first is from Algeria. In Algiers, there is a French colonial monument, which, when Algeria declared its hard-won independence, an artist was commissioned to recontextualize this monument for the Algerian nation. What they did was encase the original French monument in a block of stone, visually obscuring the original structure but keeping it intact inside. The idea was not to entirely erase the previous colonial history, but to call attention that a change had taken place, and what this meant to the history was to alter the face of this monument to respond to the current public memories. We can also look at the Jackson Center in the Northside District here in Chapel Hill and the ways in which they're trying to preserve, through oral histories, local markers, and public outreach, the history of a historically Black neighborhood. Another example of how perhaps technology could aid in bringing to light voices historically ignored is a proposed digital project in Brooklyn, New York, where archival photographs of a free slave community that once lived in those same streets were projected at night onto the current streets to give a visual voice to this lost community. So by day, we have our current scene of day-to-day in Brooklyn, and by night we can see the relived experiences through these photographs that are contextualized with added information. We should look to these examples to navigate how public spaces represent historical memories and our cultural values. Part of this asks us to think about what those values are, what we as a community believe in, and how we are being inclusive or excluding people. But we should also change our public spaces when they do not represent those values, and not maintain them only because of a sense of history, which reinforces these divisions and oppression. Thank you.
Next is James Nezer. For Public Humanities for convening this conversation. I'm here wearing two hats. One is former chancellor of the university, and second as a parishioner of this church. As most of you know, the name of our village comes from an Anglican chapel that was established by the British that stood somewhere over near where the Carolina Inn is today. If you walked to this new structure past the old chapel, you would have seen the date 1843, which is the year it was constructed. Very possibly by slaves. For certainly it has a balcony in it where the slaves sat. If you were to go into that chapel and you looked at the lectern, you would see these words: in memoriam, Mary Ruffin Smith, 1888, the year of her death. Mary Ruffin Smith owned slaves. And her slaves sat in that balcony, and as they became converted to Christianity, they were baptized in the chapel. Fast forward to the 1970s, when Polly Murray, the first African-American female priest in the Episcopal Church, she was ordained in 1977. And she celebrated her first Eucharist at the invitation of this church in that chapel where her grandmother was baptized as a slave. That is our history. I would submit to you that every institution in the South that has roots in the first half of the 19th century or into the 18th century has racism in its core. It is the original sin of the American experiment. I'm also keenly aware of this history at the university, as has already been mentioned. Many of our buildings, all of our historic buildings, carry the names of people like Mary Ruffin Smith. Julian Carr is on one of our buildings, and he gave the infamous speech at the dedication of the Confederate monument, and Carver is named for him. How do we deal with this legacy of racism and white supremacy? The church obviously, and by the way, every church on Franklin Street has a similar history. The Methodist Church was divided at the time of the Civil War. I grew up in Texas, and all the Methodist churches were Methodist Episcopal South churches. The Presbyterian Church was similarly divided by the Civil War. And the church has been able to move on. By the way, Polly Murray is a fascinating character because she applied for admission to the UNC Law School